Grammarly, Grammarly.
Philip! Go ahead and take care of her. Enjoy. Help her connect the dots. When Sparrow did sing about the white meat and thing, and them start to fret like he never eat a dark meat yet. But if ever you lack the understanding of once you overlap in the pages of history, will document Harry's testimony. You know what? The prince gave up his money. The prince gave up his throne. The prince gave up his power. Why? Just for dark meat alone. The family was sour. The queen, she might sing she soul, but the mother go proud when they singing out loud. What? Dark meat to the world. Harry tell them, once you go back, tell them you'll never go back. Tell them, once you go black, you'll never go back. The haters on social media say that Harry will soon regret, but they will never understand why he leave it, because they never eat a black meat yet. Harry tell, oh Harry, oh let's sing it. Oh Harry, oh Harry, oh Harry. What's your name? Harry messed with the pride when he introduced his bride. The queen, she wasn't happy. She was like, what nonsense is this, Harry? It was a big joke. Harry near made the woman catch a stroke when he proclaimed, yes I do, to a woman of a darker hue. So with that, the prince gave up his money, and then he kicked away the throne. He tell him he ain't want no power. Why? Just for dark meat alone. The family always sour. The queen, she might sing she soul, but the mother go proud when they singing out loud. Melanin to the world. Harry tell, once you go black, never, you'll never go back. Never, never. Once you go black, never, you'll never go back. The queen say, Harry, my grandson, you was always happy with the rules what we set, but she can't feel what Harry is feeling because she never eat a black pig yet. Harry tell them, everybody say, go Harry. What? Go Harry. Louder. Go Harry. You know what the truth? Listen, it's Harry who made the call. He said, not my wife at all. It still makes us shudder the way the people treat his mother. So Harry decided to live his life colorblind. Well, he raised some eyebrows for sure when they saw his Rasta mother-in-law. So King gave up his money. The prince gave up his throne. The prince said, want no power. Why? Just for that meat alone. The family done sour. And the queen, she might sing she soul, but the mother go proud when they singing out loud. Yes, that meat to the world. Harry tell, what? You'll never go. Never. Once you go black, you'll never go back. Harry brother it inside. His short time in the palace, he enduring all the malice. Some men want to say it, but half of them who complaining was racist. They thought that Harry wouldn't have gone as far as to marry. But the power of this black beauty make him go down on not one but on the two knees. So he first gave up his money and then he kick away the throne. He telling me I want no power. Why? Just for that with alone. The family stolen shop and the queen in pure misery. But he mother go proud cause Harry is now contributing to black history. Harry said, once you go black, never, you'll never go. Never, never, never. Once you go black, you'll never go back. Harry say, my love, pack your clothes. Let we ship out with no regret. Cause these people can't grasp why it's so finger licking because they never eat a black meat. Yeah. Harry say, go Harry. What we say? Go Harry. Go Harry. Love you.
Recordings just got better.
Yes.
Hey, it's Dana from StreamYard. I'm so excited to announce that local.
Yes. It's so nice. So nice to be West Indian. I am telling you. But I don't want to give that up for anything else. As I have said so many times on this program, you ain't gonna find that kind of music in Calcutta. You ain't gonna find that music, although the roots of that music is in West Africa. You ain't gonna find that kind of kaiso in West Africa. We be in a league by ourselves. Go Harry. Terry Ann Lyons, the daughter of Super Blue Boy, to the old timers like me and Eric. We all young people know this. Jump and wave. We know him as Blue Boy doing Airtel and Rebecca and so on. That's his daughter. Terry Ann Lyons. She won the crown in 2022 with that song, Go Harry. And I remember teaching that song in my Calypso class. And, what should I say? Most of the students in the class weren't looking like me and you, Eric. But at the end of the class and until the end of the semester, they were singing, Go Harry, Go Harry. The story here of the Palace School by Melanin. Eric Phillips, good evening, my brother.
Good evening, David. How are you?
I'm doing fine. It's good to catch up with you again. I know you've been quite busy moving around and doing our work. You know, our foreparents who said doing God's work, doing the ancestors' work. And, we got to keep doing it. CLR James says there's always something to be done. I think it was Lenin asked, what is to be done? CLR James said, there is always something to be done. And I mean, you are the epitome of that. We want to talk tonight about Geneva because a lot of waves were made in Geneva. We had the presentations by Padre G, presentations by the government. We dedicated last week 4 days to the discussions in Geneva. And you were there, and there were some eyebrows raised because some people mistakenly felt that you were part of the government delegation. But you sent me the letter of invitation to you from the chair of the proceedings, inviting in your capacity as chair of the Guyana Reparations Committee and, of course, vice chair of the Caribbean Reparations Committee. So tell us let's clear that up for us. You were there representing the reparations committee, right? Talk to us.
Yes. In January, we met in Jamaica to redo the 10-point plan. One of the persons invited was Dr. June Sumer, or Ambassador June Sumer, who's from St. Lucia, who was at that time the incumbent chair to the Permanent Forum. She invited me in January and subsequently sent me a letter because one of the key panels was reparations, sustainable development, and economic justice. And she had asked me to put together a paper, which I did, 19 pages. So I was officially invited in my capacity as chair of the Guyana Reparations Committee, but I was also the most senior person for the CARICOM Reparations Commission in Geneva. I did travel with the government because they have to approve my travel. Unlike Ipadaji, I do not have a checkbook. I do not have an account. Anytime I have to travel, I have to send it to cabinet to be approved. Cabinet approves it, and they normally buy the ticket. And so I traveled to Geneva and was there for the entire event.
And of course, Eric, this is so because the government has signed on to the Caribbean Reparations Initiative, right?
Yes, yes. And President Ali is one of the 5 prime ministers on the Prime Ministerial Subcommittee on Reparations, which then reports to the broader body of CARICOM heads of states.
Good evening to all of you who are joining us. We have Mr. Eric Phillips here tonight, and we are going to be talking about what he said in Geneva, Switzerland, of course, last week. Was it last week? I think it was last week. Yes, last week. We covered the forum.
The 16th to the 19th. Yeah.
Right. And we did 4 programs, Tuesday through Friday, by the Ipadaji people. And we are talking to Mr. Phillips tonight to get from him what is it he said there. So please share the link. Please share the link. I see all the regulars are here already. Mr. Vibert White from the East Bank, Mr. Carl Wong from the East Bank, Mr. Cork didn't say where he was, but we have people who are joining us here from St. Louis, Missouri. You know, that part of the world is Missouri.
I spent 2 years there, Missouri.
I was just about to say that when you were a White House fellow, I knew you were somewhere out there in the Midwest.
Yeah.
And I thought it was in Missouri.
Yeah, Missouri.
Yes,
yeah.
An interesting place. When I got my first job on the West Coast of the United States, I was living at that time in Maryland, and I drove from Maryland to California. I packed my thing in my car. Yeah. And I drove and I overnighted in St. Louis. You plan it. It took me about 3 days to drive across the country. Quite an experience. Yeah. And I overnighted in St. Louis. And one of the things I remember is jazz. I mean, from the time you hit that place, it's jazz. There's that big arch there.
Yeah, Walter Middy's is a big club out there, jazz. Yeah.
Yes, jazz was in the air. I remember that. So I said, wow, this is jazz country. Some places you go and it has a certain smell. St. Louis has a certain song to it. And it's that jazz. Good evening to all of you. Keith Beresford, Dr. Keith Beresford. We talked earlier today. Keith is always a regular. He's my go-to man when I can't find a calypso. He's more of a calypso connoisseur than I am. And he promised to send me a calypso on Roger Khan, sung by the late Mighty Rebel. And I'm going to share that next week with you all. But yes, so many people have been contacting me about Calypso and so on. I'm glad that we've been able to, a little interest in Calypso. Soca is calypso. The soul, soca is the soul of calypso. You see, the soul of calypso. The Lord Shorty, or later Ras Shorty I, the inventor, is kind of a fusion of the African and Indian beat with a little bit of synth, a little bit Creole music coming out of uh, the southern part there of the United States of America. And so what we call soca today is really a kind of playing around with the original calypso. But as Michel Montano say, soca is the child of calypso. You can't beat that. Eric, so this was the third meeting. Did you attend any of the previous two? Eric, are you hearing me?
Yes, I'm hearing you. You're breaking up, but I can hear you. Yeah.
All right. So I was saying that this is the third meeting, and I was asking whether you attended the first two meetings.
No, I didn't. The topics were different. The first was in Geneva. The second was in New York. I knew what occurred there because I participated in writing some of the stuff that was shared there. And of course, this third one, which would speak about the second decade, had as a key theme reparations. And indeed, coming out of the declaration, reparations is central to the second decade. Haiti is central to the second decade. Brazil, there were a couple of thousand people registered. There were 85 side events. The Brazilians had the largest delegation, lots of NGOs, but also their minister, because Lula has. And I didn't go to the first two, but I was invited by June Suma.
And of course, reparations headed the list of topics. There were 4 topics there, and reparations headed that list of topics that was discussed there. And you made your presentation on reparations. Eric, as I always do when you come here, I ask you to do 2 things. One, to put reparations in larger historical perspective. And secondly, which I do at the end, is ask you to give us a report on what you're doing, because your work is ongoing. So I start with asking you to put reparations in perspective. I do so because I think we have come a long way in making people much more literate about reparations. That's one. But we also have to deal with noise. And I say noise, meaning we have to deal with attempts that are made generally to confuse the meaning of reparations and exactly what it means. So please put
David, you're so
in this
right.
larger perspective for us. Yes.
Well, as you know, David, CARICOM just celebrated its 10 years in renewing the push for reparations. And of course, there's been and the King companies have apologized. Several provinces in Holland have apologized. The church has apologized. The Portuguese Prime Minister said they're going to apologize. And CARICOM has been at the heart of this. We've brought in the African Union. They're now part of the concerted effort. We had a conference with them in both Barbados and in Ghana. We nursed and helped to sponsor the North American Reparations Commission. We've nurtured several other committees. We brought in the Dutch. There's now a National Reparations Committee in Holland. So it's moving rapidly, and there have been several valuations. The latest valuation has been $70 to $130 trillion owed in reparatory justice. That was the Brattle report. People, however, forget that in 1994, the group of eminent persons led by Chief Abiola they had valued it to 777 trillion. So it's been there for quite a while. But clearly, the first decade should have been about reparations. The Europeans fought it, so the word reparation was not in the theme. What was in the theme was recognition, justice, development, which people don't really realize is recognize the crime, reparatory justice, and use the reparations for development. The second decade will occur and will have in the theme the word reparations. And that's because there's been an overwhelming global response. And everyone who was in Geneva supported the second decade and supported the concept that reparations is central to this. Brazil is in turmoil. They need reparations. Haiti is in turmoil. Reparations. The Caribbean civilization is at risk. Coming on board. Africa is coming on board to create their own reparations commission to work hand in hand with us in CARICOM. So there's been a transformation in terms of reparation, in terms of people accepting it. The group in the UK, Repair, just did a survey in the UK, and for the first time, people in the UK are acknowledging reparations. So that's a big step. And of course, it's the theme of lots of different things in Guyana. Every event we have, whether it's emancipation, Kwanzaa, we try to bring in that theme. So that's what has happened. And so for the second decade, reparations is going to be central to everything that's done. It's not just financial reparations, but as the Brazilians stated, you need to have spiritual reparations because they're being harassed in Brazil because of their religion, their spirituality. There's climate justice, which is another type of reparations. So as you look at reparations now, everything is coming full circle. And all the things are heading into concentrated now into the theme of reparatory justice, whether it's for climate, whether it's for crimes against humanity, etc. So that's where we are on the global scene. The momentum is unstoppable, and everyone is on board, including the heads of states of the African Union.
Eric, I was almost blown away 2 days ago when I picked up the newspaper, one of the Caribbean newspapers, and I saw the report there that the Portuguese have decided to take responsibility for David. And I thought that was colossal, largely because of the role that Portugal played in Brazil. Of course, Brazil was a Portuguese colony, and we know the size of Brazil, and we know that
40% of all the enslaved went to Brazil. 40%.
There you go.
Yeah.
Over to you.
And by the way, David,
give us the facts.
Yeah, the papal bulls, right? The papal bulls, which is the Catholic Church.
The Catholic Church,
saying that you can enslave anyone who's not Christian. It was the Portuguese who first acted on it, King Alonso. Yes. So it's full circle now that the Portuguese Prime Minister himself, it's a full circle. And I'm working with a group out of Guinea-Bissau, Sipiwe Balanta. What they've decided to do today, and they've asked me to help, is they're going to get Brazil, Guinea-Nassau, and several other come together in like a CARICOM reparations committee. So there's going to be a Portuguese nation reparations commission modeled after CARICOM, and they have written a letter, which I have here, this is the letter here. They've written a letter today to the Portuguese Prime Minister asking about reparations. So as much as we're not, Portugal wasn't in Guyana, they're asking CARICOM and myself in particular to help them mold a reparations commission, and they will then pursue the same strategy, a 10-point plan, etc., with the Portuguese. And that is, as you said, significant because it's full circle.
It's full circle. And just to remind ourselves of our history, you talked about the papal bull there, and I remember as a little boy going to school, I don't know if they teach those things in school anymore, but certainly, you know what time, Eric, when we talk about the papal bull where the Pope divided the world between Spain and Portugal.
Yes,
it was a ecclesiastical
law.
Yeah, I remember
ecclesiastical law. Yeah.
Yes, I remember Jimmy Bridgman teaching me that in second standard. You know?
And that's why Brazil is Portuguese and everywhere else is Spanish.
Exactly.
In Latin America, in South America.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And just to remind ourselves also that when they talk about the prosperous sugar colonies, you're talking first of Haiti, and then Cuba, and of course
Cuba,
Brazil
Brazil.
was always there. And
Yes.
the French, the Portuguese from Brazil alone roped in probably more than the rest of them who were
Yes.
operating because
And
of. Yes, go ahead.
it started in 1441 when they captured 10 Africans and took them to Lisbon and had them on display.
Yes,
And of course, that evolved into the largest, at the time, the largest nation in the slave trade. And indeed, Brazil has over 110 million Afro descendants.
there you
And
go.
one of the themes that came out of this conference, and by the way, I was involved in 5 side events. The first one is with the Nation of Islam. This was they asked me to be their keynote speaker. So even before I went to Geneva, I was on one of the side events with the Honorable Silas Mohammed and Attorney Malik Shabazz. And they asked me to speak on a critical concept, which is for the second decade, they would like all Afro descendants, whether you're in the United States, Brazil, Guyana, to be called Afro descendants. And that Afro descendants should be treated as a special people, similar to indigenous people, so that they can then approach the ICJ collectively. Because the dilemma in the United States is that they're not, as Africans are not in control of a sovereign state. They're a minority. And so what CARICOM could do as a sovereign state, people of African descent in the United States cannot. So the Black Muslim Nation, which is really a strain of Malcolm X, they're now saying, and they have their own reparations committee called AFRE, which is registered with the UN. They're now saying, and they passed a petition, and I was part of that 2-hour meeting prior to leaving for Geneva. They've put a resolution into the permanent forum that Afro descendants should be the terminology, not Black or Negro, but Afro descendants. And that's simply because, and the Brazilians call themselves Afro-Brazilians.
Afro-Brazilians, yes.
Yeah, and they're African first, and Brazil is where they're from, where they were born. Yeah. So that was a big issue in terms of repositioning of people of African descent as Afro-descendants. And I know you've said many times that there's always a duality. I mean, you could be Guyanese, but you could be Guyanese of Indian descent, African descent. That's who you are. Guyanese is your geography and maybe where you were born, but you are of African descent or Indian descent or Chinese descent or Amerindian descent. And people get upset at that because they're only thinking in terms of racial context.
Exactly. And talking about race and Brazil, Brazil has this interesting history of race. First of all, Brazil has these hundreds of shades of black.
Yes.
Because the Brazil, unlike the Americans who said, kick them out of there, we don't want to mix with black. The Brazilians encourage racial mixing in order to get rid of blackness, but ended up increasing the black population. Speak to that, please.
Yes, and in Geneva, you saw the whole color scheme. From people who are black to people who are Afro-descendant who almost look white.
Yes.
And there are all these gradations, colorization. And with that came different benefits. And interestingly enough, the flight to Geneva took us to Miami through Portugal. And when you were at the airport in Lisbon, you see all these black people at the airport in positions and customs and that. But Brazil is the ultimate area of enslavement, of inequality, of racial discrimination, of xenophobia, of spiritual harassment, because it is so huge and so diverse. And when you hear the Brazilians speak, they're very articulate. And what was interesting is that the majority of them were females. And they either had big afros or big locks. the Brazilians. So it was quite fascinating, and they're proud of it.
Yes, I went to graduate school 40 years ago, long after your time, Eric, and and we had to study Nascimento, the
Yes,
Brazilian Pan-Africanist.
Pan
Um,
Africanist.
oh Lord, what a fellow, what a guy. I remember in graduate school being just taken by him. But
But then you have the Quilimbolos, right? Those were the
yes,
Maroons.
right, right.
Yes,
Right, right, right. But Eric, Portugal is important on both sides of the Atlantic. Huh? And
yes,
I noticed you mentioned Guinea-Bissau because they,
yes.
they, they quote unquote colonize Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau.
Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, yeah,
And they were the last to
to get rid
leave
of slavery. In
slavery.
1888, they were the last.
There you go. In case y'all are just joining us, yes, it's Politics 101. And yes, this is the place where you always learn something. I always learn something. And one of the things when you have Eric Phillips on, he has those things at his fingertip. I know sometimes you all call me the historian, but when it comes to these things, Eric has them done. Eric, let's talk a little bit. We're getting to Geneva. We're traveling.
Yeah.
Black people be always traveling, right? People always want to know, why traveling is such a thing. You grow up and you hear somebody's dying and they say, she traveling, she going home. So we have this thing about traveling, the movement of Jah people, exodus and so. So we moving, we
Yes.
traveling. But we got to make this stop because we have had initiatives in recent time, and I heard it at Geneva. I think you may have sent that clip to me, but we heard it in Geneva. What to do about what to do about indentureship vis-a-vis reparations?
Yes.
And we have found ourselves in a
It is
time.
fascinating, David. Yes, it was quite fascinating. For the 4 days, the word indentureship was mentioned once. And it was mentioned in a funny way by Guyana. The Secretary General of CARICOM, Barnett, even though the CARICOM heads of states had declared that they would be looking at reparations for indentureship, did not include that in her presentation to the forum. The UN Secretary General spoke, Barnett spoke on CARICOM, and then Vice President Marquez from Colombia spoke. And I would say this to you, David. If you were in that environment for 4 days, you would not have brought up the concept of reparations for indentureship because you would have been killed. Because the pain that you felt there from people speaking of their experiences, the passion, and to equate indentureship with anything that was there would have been suicidal because they're so fundamentally different. And so no one else brought it up, and there were hundreds of speakers. And so we in CARICOM are pushing it, at least at some level, at a prime ministerial level, under the pretext of ethnic solidarity in the Caribbean. That's what I've been told, that we don't want a divided Caribbean, we want ethnic solidarity, and that's why the 3 prime ministers are pushing CARICOM in the direction of looking at indentureship. Even the Dutch have refused to deal with indentureship. And as I wrote in my article several months ago, and you could have felt it in Geneva, this was a crime against humanity that has negative legacies that are significant. And then if you're saying that indentureship is equal or similar to slavery, then you're essentially saying indentureship was a Holocaust. Either it's equivalent to an African Holocaust or a Jewish Holocaust. And so that's where you get in Geneva this separation. It wasn't even considered because this was about people of African descent trying to deal with the legacies of slavery and colonialism, because colonialism is also significant in terms of reparations.
Colonialism
You
is
look
also.
very young there.
Yes, yes, yes. I did that interview with Carla Barnett. You
Carla
mentioned
Barnett.
her, the Secretary General of CARICOM. I did that interview with her in Belize, where she's from, and I'm trying to
Yes.
remember the year 2003. So yes, it was 21 years ago when I interviewed Carla Barnett, who's quite a talented and very knowledgeable person.
Yes.
And we're lucky to have her steering the ship of CARICOM. At this time, she, of course, served as the Deputy Secretary General under, who she served under? She served under Carrington. Carrington.
Yes, Carrington.
Yes,
Carrington.
she served under Carrington
Right.
there. Eric, let's now move to Geneva itself and what you said there.
Yes.
Walk us through the message that you left there in Geneva.
Right. Let me give you the process first.
Uh-huh.
There were these 4 central panels and 80-something side events. For each central panel, you had a group of experts overseeing it. And then governments were allowed to speak after the panel spoke. And then civil society was allowed to speak after. Those on the panel were given 5 minutes each. Governments were initially promised 5, but were given 2 minutes. And then civil society were given 2 minutes each. So when the first panel came about, which was reparations, sustainable development, and economic justice, I had this big long paper here, which is, I said, 19 pages. But because I only had 2 minutes, I had to summarize. And given the audience of experts and people who are very passionate about the subject, I decided to not speak to my paper, but to turn it in. As a matter of fact, Justin Hansford, who chaired the session, he is a professor at Howard University. He immediately sent one of his folks to come and get not only my presentation, but my recommendations. This is what I said. The legacies of African chattel enslavement and colonialism are on vivid display when one examines Brazil and Colombia. So in order for us to have economic justice and sustainable development through reparatory justice, I said there needed to be some necessary prerequisites because there are things the West have put in the environment to muddle the water. So I said one of the first necessary prerequisites was that we need to debunk the idea that slavery was legal. And I referenced the book and thesis by Nora Whitman, who debunked it, who showed that there were laws in Africa and that slavery was illegal, and it wasn't just European law, you had international law and trading laws and all of that. I then said we also have to aggressively reject the idea that foreign aid is reparations, because there's a big, thick document, almost 80 pages, making that argument. I also said that there needed to be a fully funded and resourced permanent forum to pursue reparations, because the first decade they were hardly funded, and that was a recipe for failure. Then I said another prerequisite is that the DDPA, which is the Durban Declaration and Program of Action, should be a core set of principles during the second decade, and that we should treat globalization as a threat to racial equality and racial equity, because globalization has created inequalities through odious contracts and through how it works. So my recommendations were the following, because I had only 2 minutes. A special international tribunal on reparations. And here, David, is that the Western countries, England, France, Germany, Spain, Portugal, they have ring-fenced their local legal systems so that you can't approach them for reparations. For example, in the UK, anything that happened pre-1953 in colonies cannot be brought to court in the UK. So we have been limited, they've forced us to be limited in our legal redress. So what we've been arguing, and I recommended here, is an international tribunal similar to the Nuremberg Tribunal, which was used for the Jewish Holocaust. And that you could do through the United Nations General Assembly, where you'd set it up with special principles so that you circumvent all of the ring fencing of the national legal systems. And this is one of the things we discussed in Accra with the Africa Union as some of the viable options. So that was my first recommendation. My second recommendation, and as I spoke, I got interrupted with cheers, put on record that reparations should be 1% of European and American GDP per year for 400 years. You know, the Brattle report says 70 to 130 trillion. The Europeans are going to say we can't afford that, it's bigger than our economy. But my argument is that slavery went on for 400 years. So give us 1% of your GDP for 400 years, and that would be fine, because we will be able to absorb it. We'll be able to plan strategically, like how the Chinese plan, 50-year plans, etc. Then I said that Afro-descendants should be globally defined as a special people. Now, a World Bank report in 2018, which was entitled Latin America, Afro-Descendants in Latin America, Inclusion, came to the conclusion that one of the things that must be done for inclusion of Afro-descendants, whether it's in Brazil or Guyana or Colombia, is that you have to have the same designation as indigenous people. And so Afro-descendants should be defined in constitutions as a special people, and this way you have special rights. Yes, and of course, Ambassador Commissar also echoed that, because he was also in Ghana when we spoke about that, and we had discussed that internally in CARICOM. And then I said that the permanent forum, my other recommendation, should engage the Council of World Mission, which has its own reparations program called NIFEA, which is the new international financial and economic architecture that deals with these types of issues. And they talk about an economy of life versus what is going on now in globalization, which is an economy of death. You're killing the environment, you're killing African people, you're exploiting Africa, you're creating climate change, all of that. And then my penultimate recommendation was that there should be a reform of the United Nations Security Council, so Africa and people of African descent have a vote, a veto vote if necessary, in the United Nations Security Council, or there should be no veto vote by any of the 5 countries, but Africa should have a seat. And then the final recommendation I made is that permanent forum should champion the immediacy of climate change as one of the critical dimensions of reparatory justice. So this was my 2 minutes that was summarized out of my 19 pages, because I couldn't go through the 19 pages in 2 minutes, but I have all the documents. And in my 19 pages, I was very deliberate and intentional in highlighting the link between reparations, sustainable development, and economic justice. And I talked about our historians, I talked about our eminent persons, I talked about Dr. Eric Williams, I talked about, you spoke about him from CLR James, who was really the first person that talked about the European owe us a labor bill. I talked about Ali Mazuru, Walter Rodney, Hilary Beckles, John Henrik Clark, Chika Diop, Chancellor Williams. And then I went through a lot of things about reparations and what it means and how it should be paid. And then I used 4 pages to talk about how Israel became economic power. Most people don't realize that Israel got a lot of money, and what they did, they funded 1,300 companies and bought everything for them so that they can grow. They also funded the port of Haifa, and they gave separate reparations. So I went through the whole thing about how Israel became what it is today through reparatory justice, and how we also need a Marshall Plan, and we need a development plan. So all of that is built into this document. And then I talked about, I concluded with the following. Africans were deprived of their human rights during chattel enslavement. Today, the denial of African human rights of people of African descent will continue unless reparatory justice is received. This is the International Decade for People of African Descent with the theme Recognition, Justice, and Development, which are the key elements of reparations for descendants of Africans. The time is right for reparations because without reparations, there is no sustainable development, there's no economic justice, and there's a continuation of racial discrimination and racial inequalities. So this was turned in together with my recommendations. Now, I did not deal with reparations in Guyana because the government spoke about that in the early panel, and they didn't speak about reparations in Guyana. They spoke about reparations in general, that they supported the Permanent Forum to look at reparations. And then, of course, Ipada G spoke, and that was the first interaction, the first thing that was contested. The government responded, Ipada G responded, the government responded, Ipada responded, and then the government responded. So Minister Waldron spoke, Minister Hamilton spoke, Nia Subran spoke, Vanessa Ben spoke on behalf of the government. And on behalf of Ipada, you had Nigel Hughes, Olive Sampson, and Darren Wade. And what was unique is that Guyana was the only country where you had this tension and these contradictions of what's happening. And because everyone knew I'm Guyanese, everyone came to me because I have links with 480 NGOs in reparations. We have a website, we have a WhatsApp group, and it is clear that people understood what was going on in Guyana because they'd been following it from the first and second meetings. And I think the fact that Subran was there, a lot of people took umbrage to it because just a few months earlier, there had been an event for indigenous people, and there were 5 indigenous people from Guyana who spoke. So there was these controversies, there were the contradictions. There were a lot of side discussions about Guyana. And of course, that's what happened.
That's what happened. Eric, I want you to address a couple of quick questions. You talked about the indigenous peoples, and that's an area that you have been taking a very active interest in researching and bringing to bear in the public space some very important facts. And I was on a program this week, on Wednesday, on GlobeSpan, with our friends over there, Ravi Dev and Ramarak and so forth. And Ravi sought to push back against the notion that indigenous people were given lands, and saying that what they did at independence was that the state independence honored treaties that the British and the Dutch had signed with the Amerindians, including treaties to catch, escape, enslaved people. And so that this land that was awarded to them was not awarded them, it was in keeping, and I hope I'm representing Ravi here correctly, it was in keeping with treaty obligations of the British.
He's lying. He's absolutely lying, and he's trying to make excuses. Let me give you some of the facts.
Please do.
The British and the Dutch engaged the Amerindian community to be a police force for enslaved Africans, paid them to kill us and bring us back if we had escaped. And these treaties were not official treaties, because I would ask Ravi Dev, show me the treaty. I could show you the Maroon Treaty in Suriname, the Maroon Treaty for Acapulco in Jamaica. There was no treaty, but there was an agreement. And indeed, most people don't realize that part of the failure of the 1763 rebellion was that indigenous people blocked coffee from coming out of Berbice into Essequibo Demerara. And so they were accomplices in defeating coffee in 1763. So first, there was no treaty. Second, they were used as police. They were paid. And what people don't realize, David, and I share this with you, prior to enslaved Africans being here, the Caribs and the Arawaks attacked 7 other indigenous groups, killed the men, and sold the women and children to the Dutch. And that is a significant document here that is hidden from our history. So when people say Africans killed Africans or Africans sold Africans, it was the Caribs and the Arawaks who first did it in Guyana. And stepping forward, at independence, there was a negotiation, because remember Campbell, the first Amerindian member of parliament, was funded by the Catholic Church and the business community to go to London. And there they pushed the British to give indigenous people lands. And first, the indigenous people had asked for 53% of Guyana. And ultimately, there was about a 40-year period of discussion from 1966 until 2006, where the Amerindian Act of 2006 was passed, giving 65,000 Amerindians at the time 13.8% of Guyana, but with a stipulation that every 25 Amerindians could form a separate group and apply for land. So we've now created 204 Amerindian groups because they're utilizing the Amerindian Act of 2006, which was passed in independent Guyana unanimously. And so they are exploiting the Amerindian Act of 2006 to claim more land. So the 13.8% of Guyana that they were given in the Amerindian Act is now about 19%. And that's been funded by Conservation International. It's been funded by GRIF, Red++. And this year's budget, the government has another 800 million for Amerindian land titles. So Ravi is lying significantly. More significantly, 3 of the 9 Amerindian groups who were getting land under the Amerindian Act of 2006 came to Guyana 100 to 200 years after Africans were brought here. The Waiwais came here 100 years, 200 years after. The Mukushis and the Wapishanas came 100 years after we were here. And indeed, if you look at the Rupununi uprising, it was the Wapishanas who the Portuguese encouraged to revolt against the black government. So there's a long history. And Ravi knows he's lying purposefully, because part of what he's been arguing is that when Africans get reparations in Guyana, indentured servants should also get. Mm-hmm. And he's also saying that that will bring solidarity, without recognizing that they were paid, they got lands when reparations were over, when indentureship was over. And we have a documentation of all the villages. They got funded into rice. We got burnt out to rice. We were the first people in rice. They burnt us out. So there's a long history. So I'm sorry I wasn't there to confront him. Because remember, he and Batarak had written 4 years ago a letter that said Indians cleared more lands than Guyana. And I countered him by saying, listen, Batarak, the Venn Commission said that we cleared 15,000 square miles. We know that Guyana, and that's 18% of Guyana. We know Guyana is 80% of forest. So 8 and 18 is 98. How come you cleared more than us? And they stopped. So they throw these things out there, and our politicians or historians remain dumb, and it becomes fact. Because how, if 80% is still forest and we cleared 18%, how could Indians have cleared more than us? So it's just racism in the deepest sense, because they're miseducating people and using that as a political way to get more things and to argue that Africans are getting more than they're due. So it's racism.
Eric Phillips here, and Lester Beckles is saying that Mr. Phillips needs to hold lectures in our villages. I know he does some of that, but yes, and I've decided that when I get to Guyana in a couple of in a few to do my
for your regular summer session,
to do my regular 4-month stint, that one of the things I will try to do is try to facilitate some of these lectures. We don't know how many villages we're going to be able to cover, but to use the run-up to emancipation to really get into the villages.
We can use TV though, David. We have 2 TV programs. We could use TV. Here's an important recommendation that came out of because of misinformation of African history, because of artificial intelligence and the fact that it's creating false narratives. It was recommended that universities in Africa, the Caribbean, and Latin America should work with UNESCO to create a standard narrative so that in each age group, you would have books, curricula that will tell the truth about Africa and people of African descent. Because that is one of the ways of fighting racism and racial discrimination through education. And David, when you go to the internet now, you're seeing all sorts of lies about Africa and Africans using artificial intelligence. And it's a real threat because it confuses. The images look so real. It looked like Africa. And the majority of it I'm seeing right and Christianity and the curse of Ham, a lot of lies that are confusing our young people who are being captured by these beautiful images. Even our proverbs are being misquoted on the internet using artificial intelligence. It's quite a threat to us as people of African descent.
Using artificial intelligence, as many of you have been saying in the audience, we have a lot of work to do, but we have the medium these days, the media these days, to do a lot of that kind of work. And like I said, I am dedicating some of my time in the months, the August months. I don't like to use the word summer when I'm talking about Guyana, although it is into our lexicon. But to use some of my time to ensure that we get some of this, especially to the young people. Eric, you...
David, we need to write small booklets.
Yes.
We can write 1,000 of those. We can write one a day. There's so much material. That's what we need to do, because when you write a big book, our young people don't want to sit down and read it and absorb it. So you have to give small bites. And there's so much that we could choose from. Timbuktu, the Dogons, Great Zimbabwe, the pyramids, there's so much in North, South, West, and East Africa.
Yes, you're quite right. And the first person who told me that thing decades ago, David Granger. He has those small booklets.
Yes, these little booklets. Yeah.
Yes, and he sold me on that idea. He said, David, we are moving into the era where people are not reading, but if we do these small booklets, and I would say he has really tested that thing, and he continues to do work in that area. Eric,
but David, Violet John Baptiste at Agda, through the school, gets that done. Because there's an Afro-descendant school at Agda, and in the classrooms, you have these powerful African images to immerse our kids. They're still doing the national curriculum. They're still getting 90+% passes, but they are getting the truth about their history and their culture and are learning things from the elders. What you do, because we don't have books in our homes. Yeah. I was in Makkah about 8 years ago doing a water treatment project. 5 homes, not a single book in Africa. As a matter of fact, not a single book. And when the school system doesn't teach history, others like Ravidev and Baturak and all of them infuse these lies because they're racial entrepreneurs, to confuse and talk about one Guyana and misuse our history and denigrate it because they lie on us.
Eric, when you do the comparative analysis of, let's say, indigenous people and Indian Guyanese and African Guyanese, they make it to look as though one is saying that those other ethnic groups get what they get at the expense of Africans, when in fact that's not what you're saying. Is that you're saying that we need to get as equal share. Equity yes. is what you're advocating, and I want you to
David, if you look at generational wealth in Guyana, right? Generational wealth. Most of the generational wealth in Guyana is through state assets, oil concessions, land concessions, bank loans, quarries, oil concessions, gold licenses. We've been excluded from that. Forestry. If we had the same access or equal access, we would have had generational wealth. But there was also a disadvantage because coming out of emancipation, we had nothing. But in indentureship, you were not only paid, you got land, you got 3 acres of land, 1 for your house and 2 for your garden. And people, Ravi Dev also lies about that. And also, increasingly, people don't realize that we also had indentured Africans. The first arrived on the 24th of May, 1841, and there were 13,355 indentured Africans. So they merge everything to confuse it, to make it look like if we are lazy, or the same British philosophy that we're subhuman, we're not progressive because our ethnicity makes us not business people. But we were the first entrepreneurs. We're the first doctors, lawyers, entrepreneurs, scientists, physicians, teachers, agriculturalists, and it's in our DNA. Because I know, and take my grandmother.
Eric, I want you to, as we say, stick a pin. I don't mean to cut you, but I'm cutting you. To ask you to address this question. Because you would have seen that document, the government response to Ipadaji's submissions. And part of what the government, this is not Ravi Dev and Ramarak and these guys, the government of Guyana said that they have no responsibility to Black people, African Guyanese, for what happened after emancipation, because after emancipation, Black people made poor business decisions. They bought abandoned plantations that were not profitable.
Turn them into villages.
And they plant food to eat rather than plant food to export. And so the economic condition that we're in,
we're exporting food.
Right, it's a failure on Black people's part. And so the government has no reparations to give us because our ancestors or foreparents made bad business decisions. I want you to address that issue. First of all, that we're not entrepreneurs, because what we did is that we used the land to plant food to eat, but not
First of all, David, we were the first entrepreneurs in Guyana in buying those plantations that were and turning them into functional villages. Our friend Jonathan Adams has written a brilliant article on the 12 things that were done to make our villages fail, flooding it, taxing it. But beyond that, people need to realize that there was a small group of Portuguese in Guyana, Portuguese indentured servants, and the British refused to buy stuff from our ancestors. We had to sell it to the Portuguese, who then sold it to the British. And that's how the Portuguese got economic power. Right now, less than 3,000 Portuguese own about 15% of GDP. And that's because of the generational wealth and the location and the economic architecture forced by the British onto our ancestors. So we never had capital because they didn't allow us to get capital. We couldn't do anything without fighting the crown because of all the things they were doing with taxing and the way the lands were cut. We couldn't maximize the agricultural potential. So yeah, we have been handicapped every which way along the way, from not being paid to being underpaid to our villages being attacked by 12 different ways, to the fact that we had to sell to the Portuguese, to the fact that we had to be forced into the public sector, which is what is happening today. So people blame on not being progressive, but if you were to really look at our history, everyone else in Guyana was affirmed and we were negated purposefully by the British and by the Dutch.
By the British and the Dutch. Eric Phillips here tonight, really turning up the heat. And of course, we're in school, as we always are, because that is part of what we always do. We have always been teachers. We must be. Then you go through the experience, that unique experience that African peoples have gone through. We have something always to tell the world, whether we do so in song, in poetry, in prose, in history, in scholarship, in the oral tradition, as we say. There is always something that we have to teach the world that they did not know. Because the thing about slavery is that it has left that long trail in its aftermath, what the Kwayanas call the scars of bondage. That what we are fighting today is not necessarily slavery, but we're fighting the scars of that bondage. And as Bob Marley said, every time I hear the crack of the whip, my blood runs cold. They brutalize our very soul. And that is why,
David, if you look at today's economy in Guyana, we are excluded from oil because of the lack of generational wealth, because we don't have a Black private sector. And if it is really thinking about one Guyana and about inclusion, the obvious thing is to help to develop a Black all have equal access to contracts when they've been affirmed over the historical period and we've been disaffirmed. And if you really want to have a true inclusive Guyana, then steps must be taken the sectoral analysis to look at the whole process of how people got state assets and why, and do the same thing that you've done for other groups, including giving us 18% of Guyana because our ancestors cleared 15,000 square miles. We have a great case in internal case of reparations because 3 of the 9 Amerindian groups weren't here before us, yet they have lands. And the Proprietary Justice Act. If we go to court, we will never lose that case. We have a legal precedent, and you got 3 groups that were not here before us. And yet 473,000 of us died to defend Guyana and to build Guyana. And during World War I and World War II, it was still Africans defending Guyana and defending the British Crown. So people are being very dishonest by saying that we are where we are because we are Black or African. And Ravi Dev and all of those others hide those facts to make it look like if Indian culture is superior. When they came here as free people, and had it not here, our ancestors would have gotten better salaries because indentureship weakened our power. It also took away generational wealth. And another thing people need to understand, and I'm very honest, I don't care who vexed. Had it not been for indentureship, had they treated our ancestors fairly, at independence, Africans and Amerindians would own all the wealth in Guyana. And Guyana would be a very different place. So the historical racism that brought in indentured servants to dilute our bargaining power, because at emancipation, there were 83,045 Africans. And from 1838 to 1917, there were 239,000 Indians brought in here, 75,000 went back. And so when you have a winner-take-all system, which was inherited from the British, you have an inherent disadvantage in any political power. And so in a winner-take-all architecture, Black people will always lose elections because the ethnic groups will combine against us. If you look at 1823, it was the Crown, it was the colony, it was the planters, everyone was against us. And 1823 is happening again today through the winner-take-all system, where groups are being nurtured. Amerindians are given all sorts of things, buffer vote, to vote against Africans. So they get carbon credits, 204 groups, got 20 million each. They got land titling. They have a ministry. They have $48 billion in this new budget because it's all a political play to make sure that the winner-take-all system, which is an egregious racist system, winner-take-all in a multi-ethnic society, and that's what's happening to us. And what Ravi Dev and others are doing is trying to find reasons to justify the inequality in Guyana by saying that it's not structural or institutional, but it's because of who we are.
Because of who we are, essentializing African people. Please like all our pages. We have a new YouTube channel called Open Word with Dr. David Hines. Open Word with Dr. David Hines, our new YouTube channel. Please follow. Go and follow us on that channel. Open Word with Dr. David Hines, our new YouTube channel. We've noticed over the months that YouTube viewers have eclipsed Facebook viewers. So YouTube seems to be more user friendly, if you will. So we have a new channel called Open Word with Dr. David Hines. Just go over there and follow us on that YouTube channel. Eric Phillips, as we wind down the program, your closing thoughts.
Well, David, Geneva was quite an experienced Guyanese in that we were in a space, an international space, where our internal situation became central and even cast a shadow over a very critical event, which is dealing with people of African descent globally and what needs to happen to bring them out of this exclusion, which is institutional, which is global, which is exacerbated through globalization and through the lack of generational wealth. The good thing, though, is that the world knows what's going on in terms of people of African descent. I sense that people know what's going on in the Caribbean, what's going on in Guyana, what's going on in Latin America, what's going on in Africa. Africa is now waking up and is joining arms with the Caribbean as sovereign states and are working together with non-state actors, which are groups in the United States and other places where they're in a minority, to ensure that there is equity and that the world itself addresses issues of inequality and exclusion. And so I'm very optimistic that the second decade will have additional breakthroughs, but it's up to us in Guyana and other people of African descent to not just complain, but to come up with solutions. Speak for me. I don't care what Ravi or others say. We have different lived experiences. We have different cultural expectations. We have different religious beliefs. So you cannot be in my shoe and think about me because you will never understand the pain and on behalf of me is a lot of crap. Something that we have to refuse and reject comprehensively.
Eric Phillips here tonight, giving us what he gives every time he comes on to this program or a similar program. Chief Eric Phillips, always a pleasure to have you on, my brother. And I hope you will be back shortly. Don't stay away too long. Asante. And to your audience, we are eternally grateful always. It's the weekend. Go kick back a little, throw back, take a sip, take a beer, relax, do something with the family, but do something for the struggle on the weekend. Never forget that there is no holiday when it comes to our struggle. And as you heard here tonight, there's a lot of work to be done, and there's a lot of work that is being done. And with people like Eric Phillips and the Ipadaji people, the ACTA people, and all around, we are going to overcome. There is always work to be done. If we live in a multi-ethnic society, we have to do African people work. We have to do Guyanese work. We have to do Caribbean work. We have to do African diaspora work. We have to do the work of the world. We are called upon always to, walk and chew gum at the same time, but operate at different levels. So thank you all so much for the support. Sister Linda Campbell out of New Jersey, Sandra Facey, Odessa. I've got to put on the I. Odessa Natoya, God, Lord, thanks that we can wear our African names with pride. Jason Benjamin, good evening. Desiree Manuel, Cheryl Pancham, all of you have certainly contributed to making our program what it is. We've just gone past our third year on Politics 101, so we're not doing too badly. You've kept us on air. Please like all our pages, follow our pages, our new YouTube channel, is Open Word with Dr. David Hines. Just take half a minute, skip over there, follow that page, Open Word with Dr. David Hines, the Open Word with Dr. David Hines on YouTube. And that's our new YouTube channel that we're trying to grow so that we offer our people the breadth of information and sources for information. So thank you all so much. I'll see you all on Monday. Have yourselves beautiful, restful, purposeful, but also do something for the struggle on the weekend. Do something for the struggle on the weekend. Whether you are in Guyana or out of Guyana, do something for the struggle.
If you hear that, black is beautiful. Santa Claus. Black is beautiful. It's a texture. Lift your head like me. You got to wear it for